All right, welcome back. We're glad you joined us. I am honored today to once again welcome SGAnon. SG and I have spent several visits in the past, and it's been a while, too long, I think. And we wanted to get caught up and hear and discuss some of the latest things that are happening because this is an unusual time. SG, thank you for being here, my friend.
Thank you for having me back, Bill. It's good to be here.
So I think you'd agree. There's just so much going on, so many odd disclosures, so many twists and turns to whatever we're going through that people can get caught up in this and get confused. Some might be in some ways a bit hesitant, even scared by some of the things that are coming out. And I think it's very important that they understand enough that fear doesn't come into this. So there's no reason for fear in any of this. No matter what's going on. We have Trump back in power. There's lots of good things happening, and people need to wrap their arms around it, understand it, and still ask some of the tough questions. Does that make sense based on what you're hearing and the people you're talking to?
Well, I think so. And honestly, Bill, I think that's probably a good way to frame the discussion today, right? This is a period of time in the war where we have just waged a major offensive, right? We were on the offensive for 18 to 24 months, really, as a cohesive MAGA population in the United States. We had the victory at the election box. We had the victory at the inauguration with a successful inauguration. And we've been pressing the front ever since. But the bulk of the fighting force is stopping to take a drink of water and catch their breath. And so it's easy in that period of time to become overwhelmed by all of the things that are still going on, right? We still have obstruction inside the judiciary. We still have obstruction inside the deep state government. We still have the bureaucratic apparatus that even just a few days ago, published by Benny Johnson, is actively seeking to thwart the Department of Health and Human Services using CIA tactics and playbooks, right? These things are coming out. So the war does go on. But it is worth stepping back and keeping in mind how far we've come and what we still have yet to accomplish, and the fact that we can still accomplish that. You said a second ago that fear doesn't come into this. We do not have a spirit of fear deep within our bone marrow. We have a spirit of power, of love, and of a sound mind. We're strong beings, quite literally at our core. We have more capabilities and more effect on the physical world and on the reality around us than we give ourselves credit for. Christ bestowed that Holy Spirit to us in the upper room and allowed us to have that leverage again in the spiritual realm to move things in the physical. And so that's what we're relearning as a civilization and as a people, not only in the United States and in the West, but across the entirety of the world. And that process does take some time. It's not without its frictions, and it's an all-encompassing process. All of society, all of government, all of finance, all of commerce, our common understandings of how we interact with one another, what our common tolerances and things that we'll put up with and not put up with, what those are and how we determine those, right? Our belief systems are expanding and gaining more depth. We're having this discussion about these hidden texts that may be resurging in the modern era to give us context and historic perspective on where we've come and who we are. We've got the issue of UAPs just again today brought up by Representative Luna, an active sitting congressperson in the United States Congress, referencing commonality of interest on this particular issue with Chuck Schumer, of all people out there, right? So this is a whole of society, a whole of ideological movement where we're having the understanding of who we are as human beings expanded and uplifted to bring us closer to God.
That's a wonderful way of framing a number of the different things I think we're going to talk about today. It's a lot of ground. So let's start with the cautionary note, and that is there is still things going on, especially in government, and you touched on one, and that is the effort to undermine both Trump, but now also RFK Jr., specifically, I believe, because of the things that he is bringing out with regard to big pharma and the concerns there of what may have been done, even including potentially the CDC and information that was kept from the American public, which unfortunately may have left people in the public, even children, exposed to things that they should not have been exposed to. So one of those manifestations, if you will, of this strange, working against either Trump or whatnot, came out this week. There was a there was a protest, if you will, or a press conference, I think they deemed it, by Epstein victims. And they said, well, we're not going to wait. We're going to go ahead and put together our own client list to disclose. And then Tom Massey and, believe it or not, MTG joined that press conference to support these people. Now, at first, it looked like, well, gosh, yeah, they're going to release this stuff that's important for us to know about Epstein. But look in the background. There were signs all over this crowd that did not just go after Epstein. They implied some level of complicity by Trump and others around Trump. And in fact, this was a fascinating occurrence. What ended up happening was James O'Keefe, and we won't show this right now, but just talk about it. James O'Keefe interviewed one of the people in the crowd. All of a sudden, you realize that someone behind James O'Keefe is motioning to this woman to quit speaking, to stop talking. And it turns out later on that this gentleman represents an organization known as FLAIR. And FLAIR's stated mission is to essentially get rid of Donald Trump, including taking through impeachment, getting a conviction, and removing him from office. So what was the real agenda here? And what were we supposed to deem from this press conference? Just one example, I think, of we're getting into a time when the cloak, the masks, if you will, are going to have to come off some of these people, and they will show who they really are. I was fascinated by something you posted the other day, which ties Thomas Massey into a previous relationship, maybe a current relationship with one of the secret societies, one of the secret organizations. And I believe it ties through, is it the De Morlaix?
Indeed, De Morlaix International.
Right. And that's also tied to the Knights Templar, is it?
It is. It's a Masonic brotherhood primarily oriented at young adolescent and developing adolescents and very early adulthood ages before those age groups would pick another rite of passage or another rite to study if they want to stay within the secret societies. And I brought that up. The post that you're referencing is a post that I captured from De Morlaix International from their Facebook page, I believe, congratulating Massey on his reelection and really, heaping the praise onto that. And, I don't want to mislead the audience out there in a direction that I can't, corroborate physically and confirm authoritatively. But I will say that I find it very odd that at this point in the game, you have Thomas Massey, who has presumably been aware of the corruption for a while. He's hinted as much on Tucker Carlson, discussing the AIPAC situation and really attempting to paint himself as an exception to the rule with the Israeli crowd. And while that may be true, I find it very odd that there's not been a more fervent voice from Mr. Massey on all of these other major issues. I also find it very interesting that Mr. Massey did not object to the certification of the 2020 election. Mm-hmm. And in this particular press conference, I think the context of that, if we're going to talk about, Mr. Massey and, Miss Taylor Greene at the same time, I think that it's worth keeping in mind that Marjorie Taylor Greene came to power as a result of the 2020 election. So as we look at what's playing out right now, I think it's worth keeping in mind that you're going to see disinformation, and some of that disinformation may be coming from actors who understand that their time is very short-lived, and they're attempting to divert attention or destabilize or cause any sort of chaos that they can. But you also have disinformation that's very purposeful and leveraged on purpose by patriotic forces to ignite a particular issue and galvanize the public in a particular way. And we've seen that come out a number of different times over the last 4 or 5 years. Everything from investigative reports tying back to Durham and others, all the way up to things like, the 2020 up to the 2024 election. We saw the narrative seeding about significant events and interference coming from China. And so all of these sort of dovetail together to create a landscape that is quite frankly confusing. It is the fog of war, if there ever was a fog of war. And when I saw this press conference, what struck me very strangely about it is that most of the time victims are not willing to expose each other. They don't care to expose themselves, but they don't really seek to band together in a crowd and put their faces out there in front of the entirety of the world. Most of them in my experience, and I don't have a great deal of experience, but my prior life experience has me intersected with some groups of traumatized individuals and mental health and therapeutic counseling services related to that. I can tell you that a great deal of that swath of the population really just wants to go back to their lives and wants to be left alone. So
Yes.
for there to be a conference of this nature, for it to be led by a U.S. House representative who has not really had skin in the game with respect to the corruption and blackmail tying back to sexual predation inside the U.S. government, to have MTG there, which sort of adds an element of confusion even from my end. I'm like, why is that happening? What's the proximity here? What's the angle on that? We very well could have something that's a wag the dog style scenario happening there on the ground.
Yeah, you're very correct when you say we want to be fair and not make snap judgments on these folks. But one of the things that I did find in the initial review of Massey's conduct was, if you recall back immediately following J6, Massey was one of the ones who went on record specifically blaming Trump for instigating the event, and was on the dark side of all that equation. So I think you're exactly right. We need to do our work on any of these, but if it seems strange, and you just gave an example of how it looks a little different than what you might expect, it's worth us looking into it. We don't want to be misguided, and we don't want to misguide others with false assumptions. So that's the cautionary note for what folks see over the coming days and weeks and months, probably. The other thing that's been fascinating to me is disclosures regarding some of the actions of the CIA and others. And you posted a short video of a woman speaking of a reality of the mind document that was released underneath the CIA. And many people don't realize that FOIA requests in some cases and for other purposes in other cases have caused some CIA documents to actually be available, especially those going back in time a bit. And so one of the ones that I found years ago that I've always been fascinated by was something called Project STARGATE. And let me pull this up. So Project STARGATE has a summary that you can actually download and read nowadays. You can see the URL for it up there at the top. If you find it more easy, you can use your phone and simply select the QR code on the right-hand side, and you can actually download this document and read it. It describes a set of steps that were followed literally over the course of decades to investigate the power of the mind to be used in certain, we'll call them militaristic ways, one of which might be remote viewing. Others were, could there be other things that could be done with the mind that we didn't fully understand? And it really is fascinating. Here's the dates of some of the activities. You can see they go all the way back literally into the 50s. And these were some of the organizations involved up to, and in this case, this was published in I believe the 80s. And they said, well, this continues on into the present. There's another organization that is adjunct to this that has been spoken of just recently on a Joe Rogan show, on Sean Ryan's show, and it has to do with an organization started by a gentleman by the name of Robert Monroe, and it's now known as the Monroe Institute. And this gentleman, who is one of the best known remote viewers that worked for the CIA or worked along with the CIA, spoke of it. And it also came up through this gentleman, Hal Putoff, who appeared on Joe Rogan. And what's fascinating to me was, again, I found this, I don't know exactly even why now, it goes back some number of years, but when you look for it, Monroe Institute, it still exists. And it's even bigger than it was, 30 or 40 years ago. You can find it up on YouTube. And it literally has dozens of videos in multiple areas that ostensibly help people learn how to make more effective use, broader use of their capabilities, their intellectual capabilities, and their consciousness. Let me pause there for a minute. So this must have hit your radar, at least the notion of the CIA delving into these areas. Tell me about what you thought when you found that video that you had posted, please, SG.
Well, it's very interesting and it's sort of near and dear to my heart. After I had my awakening experience, I went on a multi-year journey of just troving, the sum total of knowledge available on the internet. Oftentimes during the day, even in the morning with morning coffee, oftentimes late at night. I was, an overly energetic 20-year-old who was out to save the world. And so, when I came across documents in the CIA archives, there were a lot of these documents that have been declassified since the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. Now, we have a lot of them, obviously, that have come since, really starting 08, 2010 timeframe forward, having the declass with that, which just gives so much more depth, and it's a huge volume. I think there's something like 30 or 40,000 different documents that have been declassified from CIA just in the last 10 years. Yep. But when we look at their history and we look at what they're studying, all we have to really do is take a step back from our preconceived notions about what's possible and look in two places: physics and in the modern mainstream media and entertainment landscape, the pop culture landscape, because those are the two arenas that we see what is actually capable and what's possible and things that they're trying to do. So when we talk about consciousness projection and we talk about the ability to control the capabilities of the human being at a level beyond the level of our five physical senses, which pretty much all of us are accustomed to how that feels, how that looks. But there is a deeper capability that does exist there. It's why they've spent trillions of dollars to poison our air, food, and water. They're trying to turn off those capabilities because those capabilities would make us essentially impossible as a creation under God to enslave and manipulate. And so as we look at what the CIA has gone into in research over the last 50 years on these topics, they have essentially figured out, by way of their various projects and compartmented experiments and things like that, how to control in an astral projection format this concept of awareness. And so if we think of the human body as a physical being, an organic flesh, blood, and bone, makeup, we also know that it has an electrical field, right? We also know that it has a magnetic field. We also know that it has a certain chemical makeup that exists within the cellular function of all of the cells in the body. And those chemical makeups are slightly different for each different individualized and specified type cells, right? And so as we look at the human body, it is the physical format, but it is the constellation of all of these different intangible or perhaps invisible qualities. Electricity is not something you see in the air, but it's all around you. We can see it when we run our feet across the carpet and we shock ourselves on the light socket. Magnetism is the exact same type of thing. You can't see magnetism around you, but you know what happens when you put your fridge magnet onto the front door of the fridge itself. There is a reaction there. There's an exchange that's happening in the physical medium of this reality that exists in an invisible way, but it affects the physical medium nonetheless. And so when we look at consciousness is the animating force. Consciousness is the Holy Spirit of the living God. Consciousness is the energy that comes from that place that is all and nothing at the same time and animates everything within the body and everything that is around us, right? The earth has a consciousness about it that expresses itself the way God wills it to. The birds have a consciousness. The good book tells us this. It talks about the different kingdoms and phylums that God built and created in the very beginning. And so as we look at the human being, we have an awareness that ties back to who we truly are at what we would call a soul level, what other people would call a Holy Spirit level or an intersectory level with the divine. I've heard chakras before. It doesn't really matter what you term it. There are intersectory points in the human body that are within and without this physical reality, if you will. And consciousness is our awareness in the moment, our conscious understanding that dynamic or a dynamic exists. And so if we can control how we perceive the world when we are asleep, for example, if we could consciously move our mind while resting the body in a rejuvenative fashion, taking it outside of the physical interaction, but into the world in an astral way, which is essentially what the CIA has been working on along with DIA and a few other agencies over the last 75 years, then that would allow for essentially unlocking a capability long dormant inside the human being. And I want to draw your audience's attention to this idea. If we're looking for sort of a visual of how these things could or would potentially look, if we're trying to conceptualize it, go back to the movie Doctor Strange, produced by Marvel Studios. There's a moment in the early scenes of the movie where a guru or some sort of monk or individual that has clearly practiced in spiritual awareness and centeredness for a very long time knocks the astral electrical body outside of the physical body of one of the main characters in the movie. But the astral form is still maintaining the awareness of what it is, who he is in an individualized fashion, but that awareness now exists outside his physical body. I'm certain that some of your audience out there, if they have very vivid or lucid dreams, or they go on sort of dream walking style escapades at night, they would understand the feeling of that. It can be very exhausting to have a dual awareness of a dual reality in the moment, quite literally being split across the dimensional gateway. And so, or excuse me, the dimensional veil. And so as we look at what the CIA has been doing and all of the defense, the deep defense projects and the black site projects, what have they been doing for a number of decades? They have been attempting to understand and then control the spiritual capabilities of the human being, the spiritual anatomy and endowments that human beings have when we're birthed into this world, animated again by the spirit of the living God. And that is one thing, Bill, that try as they might, they have never been able to control it. They've been able to instigate it. They've been able to understand it. They've been able to map it. They've been able to build charts about it. They've written hundreds and hundreds of papers about it. They're able to manipulate it with some amount of deliberateness. But as far as controlling the entirety of the human being right back to that core animating force of consciousness and free will, they have never been able to do that.
And they would like it just as well if we knew nothing about it and just went on our busy way during our days and never really looked into this, wouldn't they? So what I found very, very fascinating was the fact, and you mentioned it, they've been doing this for upwards of 70 years or longer. It doesn't sound like a government agency or agencies would stay at something like this if they weren't having some level of success. And when you listen, we would encourage you to listen to the interviews with these folks that report what their experiences have been. And some of them have been fascinating. Some have been sort of military focused. They've discovered things that we now know to be true, but they discovered it from across the world without ever having traveled there. And it begins to give people a sense of, wow, is this a capability that everybody has, or is this special to only a few? And I know they've asked, I believe, both. And the answer has been they believe that almost everybody has these capabilities to various extents. And part of it is like any other capability. If you exercise it, you probably get better at it, just like practicing a sport or anything else. You get better as you exercise these things. And if you haven't exercised it, you probably have some level of innate ability. Some people call it perhaps intuition. Some people call it their little inner voice. There are a lot of people that have made very, very good decisions regarding, the recent shots and other things. Some had a very clear feeling that they should or shouldn't suscept themselves to, to these injections and so forth. And if they somehow were told, no, don't do that, well, where did that come from? Just a good guess? Maybe, or maybe something more. We talked about the Monroe Institute. I would encourage folks, again, to take a look at this. You'll find up on YouTube a large variety of various recordings in various areas, and you can actually experiment with this. I don't believe there's any reason to be hesitant or, again, nervous about it. They seem to take you through experimenting just a little bit, and as you say, most of it is around, relaxation in a very deep way, so that the connection or the spirit can find a way to do something more than it normally would, which is live inside your physical being. And I believe that many people have tried this. They must, because they have such a big following on YouTube. So Again, recommend folks, if they haven't looked at that, review it, see what it means to you. All right. Let's talk about, Trump's own communications, I'll call it. And back in, if you recall, back in the early, I believe it was just after his middle of his first term, people began saying, well, gosh, how come the press hasn't asked Trump about Q posts and about this whole thing? What does Q mean? Who do you know what this is? And so forth. Finally, they asked him during one of the press conferences, sort of late in his presidency. And I may add that to the end of our discussion today afterwards. But it was very fascinating. He said, well, I don't know much about them, but I understand they like me very much. And, and they said, well, it reports that you're somehow saving the world from perhaps a satanic type of cult. And he goes, well, if I was, would that be a bad thing? And it was just sort of magical, just magical when he said it. Do you remember that one?
I absolutely do. One of the best conferences I've ever witnessed.
So beginning in May of this year, and actually I think he did one or two last year as well, that it looked like he'd copied somebody else's post. And he started doing a little bit more of that back in May of this year. And this shows up. And he posted it on Truth Social, and it's a meme, and it says he's on a mission from God, and nothing can stop what is coming. Specifically, that second line comes directly from Q posts, and it's repeated a number of times. If you look inside the photo itself, it even gets more fascinating, because look at who's standing next to the street behind him. A little cartoon frog that many will recognize as a character known as Pepe. How could that be? And how could it be that the president would post such a thing essentially 3 or 4 months into his second presidency, or third perhaps? So then, following that comes this: all roads lead to Obama. Well, this is, if you recall, this is before the revelations that Tulsi Gabbard and others now have brought out to show that Obama and a cross-section of the administration's intelligence officials put together the Russiagate hoax in the specific goal of taking Trump and putting him in jeopardy because of being perceived as somehow being aided by Russia. So Trump posts this. Now, this was in advance of those disclosures, but he says right in here, retruth if you want public military tribunals. Again, something that's been hinted at, because if you're dealing with somebody trying to overthrow the government, you're dealing with potentially treason, aren't you? So this came out. And then August 30th, Trump posts this: the world will soon understand nothing can stop what is coming. And there in his hand is a little letter Q with a plus next to it. I'm gonna flip it to you, SG. What did you think when you first saw this pop out?
Well, it's very interesting, Bill. I've been telling people on the Q News Patriot broadcast for a long time that you have to watch the things that Trump does, not so much what Trump says. And sometimes when you listen to what Trump says, you have to listen for what the potential, multidimensional meaning would be. This is a guy who grew up in the elitist crowds. He understands how high society works. He understands how these psychopathic Luciferians think. He understands the symbolic significance of a lot of their stuff. I believe certainly after his presidency, but even before the presidency, he had a very deep understanding of the different interconnectory pathways with all of these types of things. And he's a businessman who built and demolished buildings and, built and took over corporations the entirety of his, professional life. This was, in my opinion, a perfect appointment by God for a role to take down the type of adversary and the type of opponent that has been waging war against we the people for a long time. And when we look at his communications, and I know that I'm getting off on a tangent, but I'm coming back. When we look at his communications over the last several years, all we need to do is look at how many times he has posted on Truth Social, WWG1WGA, posts by Q, in many cases, whole Q drops. I went and found an entire Q drop that had been pasted into an AI generated image. And the president shared that one. He's posted Q plus a number of times. But here's where it gets even sweeter and even deeper, Bill. After the post that you just had pulled up a second ago, where he had the Q plus in his hand from the 30th of August, we saw a special envoy to the president of the Russian Federation post that post on his publicly visible X account and remind the world that President Trump was reposting Q plus. And then he doubled down on it the very next day and put Q plus, I believe it was, with a handshake emoji and the Russian and American flags. What we have in that form is a flag-style signal, a signals intelligence coming from an envoy who is literally in the Kremlin with the president of Russia, verifying to us what Q told us back in 2018. What if Russia and China are coordinating with the president of the United States to eliminate the New World Order, the Nazi World Order, right? The NWO. Yep. And that, I think, is something that we have to step back and say, well, if that's true, then what is really happening in the world? And we just had confirmation, in my opinion, over these last couple of weeks, Bill, that not only is that true, but they're having such successes in the background that they're now more confident, more willing, to be less careful and to be more obvious with what's actually happening out there in the world. President Trump told people a number of times that his meeting with Putin went very well. We'll have a deal when we have a deal, but we're on our way there, right? We've got President Trump highlighting just very recently that he does have some concerns about the things that he's heard about Gaza. He highlighted very recently that we've got a situation in the Caribbean Sea that is not necessarily directly as it seems, and we have to take our naval forces down there and manage that situation. And you have the entirety of the surface population, what I'll call the surface level consciousness, that's wigged out about potentially being in some sort of war or some sort of geopolitical event, very much approaching it with a 1998 to 2008 mindset about how the landscape is functioning politically and militarily and diplomatically in the forefront, but not appreciating that not only has it changed, but there is an element of depth to it that is not publicly visible at first. You really have to look between the lines, but you have these brilliant moments where we're reminded again and again, for purposes of maintaining that structural integrity of mankind, that we're moving the needle forward in the background and the foreground.
Everything you said is spot on with this. I think one of the things that I felt too was something you alluded to, and that is we must be getting to the point where more people are willing to accept this, because that's part of, I think, the reason that they're more willing to show just how close we've become and are getting. What a number of folks questioned, the gentleman from Russia is, I believe, pronounced Kirill Dmitriev, and he's a special envoy. He's actually a business guy from Russia and was sent in to help put together certain things that we're collaborating on. And so folks had questioned, hey, is this real? Is this possible? Maybe somebody just made this up and posted it. Well, we went back and checked his Twitter channel, his Twitter handle, and indeed, that's the gentleman. So to your point, this is saying that I believe that they believe we are ready to see much more and are getting to the point where we can understand more about what's been done, where we are, and the realities of what we're facing. This too, even Michael Flynn posted that he would love the fact that Trump has the cojones to post this type of impression. And then he says, because he's right, nothing can stop what is coming. And so lots of people doubled down on this. And I found it encouraging. I literally put it on a broadcast that would normally be for, we'll call it more of the normies. And it did not get pushback, and it had the sense of people willing to say, there's got to be something here if everybody's weighing in on this. So I just found it a lot of fun. Okay. We also wanted to talk, there is across all of this, and we touched on it in talking about the Monroe Institute and the CIA Stargate program and so forth. there is this continued and growing sense, I think, of there's more here, there's more that we should know than we do know. And some of it delves into other realms, spiritual realms that have either been hidden or we've been in some way coerced to forget. And it's important to pay attention to these signals, because I think they are signals, they're comms, to start us thinking in various directions. We've seen Tucker again and others come out and talk about their notion of there is a spiritual realm, and it's been talked about going back through millennia, through almost every civilization. How could that be if there wasn't anything there? And so let me play something from Tucker that he said on Sean Ryan's broadcast, just to kind of give us a ground set for some of this.
And one of them, and this is of course true for Christianity, very true, is that the belief that supernatural beings take physical form. They all believe that. The Greek myths, Jesus, most famously, but that they take physical form, that they're not just like some ethereal, they're not just shadows floating around, specters, fog, that they're physical. Like they're as real as the arm of your chair. And that they reproduce with people. Again, Christianity believes that. Jesus, Immaculate Conception, spirit reproduces with human woman. If every culture in the world that we know about, has left any kind of written or physical record, is reaching the same conclusions about something, maybe there's something there.
I think that's a reasonable conclusion. He mentioned, beings having some sort of physical form when we, in some cases, don't believe or don't understand that they might. One of the things I believe he is referring to is something known as the Book of Enoch. Book of Enoch has been spoken of for many, I guess thousands of years. It predates even our current Bible, and is included, believe it or not, in the Ethiopian Bible, which actually has many, many more books to it than the Bibles that we rely on or have relied on here in modern day the U.S. and really around the world. And so the Book of Enoch speaks of angels that were expelled, fallen from heaven, and how they came down and essentially mated with human women and produced what we now call Nephilim. And these were, in many cases, giants. And so all of a sudden, on top of this being a subject to conversation, again, Paulina Luna, of all folks, starts talking about the Book of Enoch in her discussion with Joe Rogan. Fascinating. So I'm not even sure where to take it next, SG. Let me drag you in. How do you position something like this when it clearly has been expunged from our dialogue? It's not in Book of Enoch, and a number of other books are not in our current Bible. How come? What happened, do you think?
Well, I think the way to approach this is to remind the audience out there that God does not make mistakes, but God also does not think in the fashion that we as our human beings, I think, believe ourselves to conceive and understand the world, right? Sometimes the best thing to do for the long run is to let the child fall down. Sometimes the best thing to do is to allow the opponent to advance on the field, perhaps move up the field, commit an act of some sort that then moves the levers forward in another fashion. And when you have, this broad view, this omnipotent view that the Holy Spirit has, you're able to look hundreds of years into the future and understand very deeply and completely where these sequences of events at any given moment in time are going to go. And so when we look at the history of the Holy Bible of the Western world, I think we need to look at the last couple of 100 years, and then we need to go back before that and divide these into segments, the last 200 years, and then starting from about the time of Christ up until around the 1700s, right? So you've got that period of time in the last couple of hundred years. In the last couple of hundred years, there have been 3 separate significant edits of the Bible. 2 of those edits changed translational language. One of those edits actually removed several copies of certain books that were still in the Bible used by the Protestant church, but those copies were left in the Catholic Church after, I believe the year was 1868 or 1875. I forget. It's somewhere in that range. Also, for the audience out there, you can go and look up a gentleman named Schofield, who had a very cozy relationship with someone named Rothschild. And, Schofield was a translator and someone who was very well versed in creating these types of authoritative spiritual interpretations that became governing, understandings for, printing of the Bible and things of that nature, right? These books still have to be printed somewhere. They still have to be brought out into the world. So when we look at that last couple of hundred years, that in and of itself is alone enough to question the completeness of it. Not the fallibility or not of it, but the completeness of the record, right? You can have a book and be missing pages from the book, and that does not invalidate everything else that the book says. It just adds more depth to it. If you're missing whole chapters, the story may be a little bit incomplete despite it still being entertaining. So the same, I think, is true when we look at our Bible and we interpret what it means for us. Now, if we go back beyond the last couple of hundred years, there have been 5 separate, that I can find, significant translations and or destructions of major component portions of the texts that came out of the apostolic era right after the time of Christ, right? Mark actually established a school of mysteries in Egypt where he taught the mysteries of the scripture as taught to him by Yeshua, I think I'm trying to pronounce that correctly, during his time here on earth. And much of those texts were incorporated into something called the Gnostic texts. And those texts were demonized a number of different times over the last 1,500-year period. There's been several different burnings. In fact, one of the Crusades was all about wiping out some of the Gnostic record from the Middle East. So when we look at that and we appreciate what's actually happened here in the world, we have a book, we have a guide map for our life that had much more depth and much more meaning and much more clarity and a lot more detail and a ton of historic record that showcased how we arrived as a civilization and as a human species to where we are today. And all of these different accounts throughout history, right? We're missing 19 years of Christ's life. We know that he didn't just vanish for 20 years or take a 20-year nap. He had to be doing something. That's logical, I think, when we step back and we have these discussions in Sunday school. The question is, what was he doing? And some of these texts claim that he was traveling, that he was understanding how people lived in other areas of the world, that he was attempting to learn from them and understand what the Father really meant to them, so he could take that understanding then back to the people of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee and teach those types of things to them. And so when we look at the record and how I would approach this, which I think is the question that you asked at the very beginning, I would approach it in a very non-judgmental but very logical way. Sometimes the benefit for allowing something to be destroyed is because you don't have enough individuals out there of a collective size great enough to appreciate having it. And so there has to be a resurgence, a rediscovery of those types of things. You often don't get the lesson first in life, you get the test. And so the same is true, I think, in this particular arena when we talk about what's happened with our holy books. And it makes a great deal of sense that all of that would be kept hidden, that all of that would be kept in the shadows, stored away in some dark room somewhere or underneath some chasm system or cavern system somewhere, only to resurge into the world at a time when all of us can literally connect with each other in about 10 seconds from anywhere on planet Earth.
Isn't that interesting? It goes back to, such a time as this. Is this a key time for folks to learn things that have been kept from them? It seems like it might be. So his comments there were interesting. The other side of this is this notion that there are these other types of entities, and in some way might be influencing some of the things that we're seeing happen. Maybe not in a positive way in some cases. And so Tucker also spoke of that. Let me just play this briefly, and then we can delve into this a bit.
main thing they want you to believe is that the supernatural is not real. Their main interest is in convincing you that the supernatural is not real. Why has that been so important for 80 years? For you to convince me the supernatural is not real. Why do you care if I think the supernatural is real? And then you have to ask motive. Like, it's not a profit motive. Like, does it make them rich to deny that there's supernatural forces? No. What is that? And I don't know the answer, but the obvious answer is, well, because they sort of know they're working for supernatural forces, actually. But that they take physical form, that they're not just like some ethereal, they're not just shadows floating around, specters, fog, that they're physical. Like, they're as real as the arm of your chair.
So that was an earlier quote from the same discussion with Sean Ryan. It does make you pause for a few minutes when you think about what we're learning about the folks that represent our populace from states all over the country. We keep hearing about folks somehow coming up with, they enter Congress, they are getting I think it's $170,000 salary per year, and they get some campaign contributions, and all of a sudden, within a few years, they're worth 30, 40, 50, 60 million dollars. And it's impossible to accumulate that level of money without some sort of extracurricular work and activities, obviously. And so you wonder, what is it that's driving these folks? Is it purely greed? Is it purely something else? And then you layer on what was disclosed over the last couple of years, where I think it came out of another, believe it or not, Tucker conversation, that some of these people have very unusual sexual interests. And often they delve into those after they arrive in Washington as a representative. You see, the divorces of a number of folks that go to Washington, all of a sudden, within a year or two, they're divorced, and, there's hush-hush about what caused it. There's folks down in the bottom of the Capitol, apparently, ready to have sexual exploits with certain of the representatives. How is that possible? How would that be something that's a thing for representatives in our government? But it seems that it may be. Is that some sort of influence, do you think? And if so, how are we going to get to the point where we uncover it? Or will it be uncovered, do you think, for us?
Well, I think, probably the last part of that question might be above my pay grade. I think everything is going to have to be organic in a certain fashion for people, because, of course, we have to go back to the basic maxim, right? A man convinced against his will be of the same opinion still. And so when we look at what's happening, I think that there does have to be an organic, coming into that. Q tells us online that the choice to know will be yours. So there will be the opportunity to learn. There will be enough of an awareness drawn to these issues that the broad population will not be able to just ignore it. But you will have, I think, small segments of the population that for one reason or another, they just will not engage and will not expand, their awareness in those negative fashions. And, I guess in some ways I could see that. In other ways, I think that we owe it to our posterity to understand fully. But that's we wax into a philosophical and subjective conversation there. What you asked just a moment ago, or what you highlighted, I think, or postulated, is really very interesting when we look at how the Washington Monument itself works. The Washington Monument is a giant transvestite genitalia piece from a dead Egyptian god that sticks up right behind really the White. It's like right there in the middle of D.C., but it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's only a few hundred yards or maybe a half mile or so from the White House. It's not horribly far away. And the Capitol complex itself, the U.S. Capitol building, sits at the heart of, if you take an aerial satellite image style view of the Capitol complex, it's at the heart of the world's largest owl of Athena. The owl of Athena goes back to the Egyptian mythologies, and I forget the name of the goddess in that era, but it's the exact same school of thought. And we have the overlap from those two ancient spiritual schools highlighted for us really during Plato's dialogues, where the Athenians and the Egyptians were getting together at some point for a number of thousands of years really informing one another's belief system with the experiences that they were having with entities that they claimed were not from here. They claimed in some cases in the Egyptology versions that they were from the stars. Sirius B shows up in a lot of these cultures and civilizations as sacrosanct, as pivotal and centerfold to their identity and who they are. We've got the this thing that's spread online over the last few years about the Pleiades and how you have Pleiadians here. There's a post that came out on the Q boards. It was signed by a letter called R, whoever was behind the word R, that discussed how it was the Greys, an extraterrestrial race known as the Greys, that Kennedy had discovered and that Kennedy was attempting to stop and remove from influence inside the U.S. government. And apparently that influence had been gained at some point in the immediate fallout of World War II. So, the question, I think the center of the question is not, can it affect or can, these types of beings and this spiritual discussion affect the physical behavior? I think that was the core of the question. But I think the question really should be, how much does it affect the physical behavior? If we're if you take oil and water and put them in a vessel with one another, they can be emulsified. It can be mixed, but it requires a great deal of cacophony and chaos in order to do that. Outside and absent of that, you don't have the mixture. There's not a blending of those substances. So you have to add some serious torque and some serious chaos and instability to the equation. You could call it violence even to the equation in order to make those things blend. I think the same is true when we look at our human nature, right? We have a nature that is more proclivitized, if I can use the word. It has a greater proclivity for those we'll call them sinful behaviors or behaviors that really shut down who we are and pinch us off from who we are with respect to being God's extensions here in the world, extensions of the Holy Spirit, right? Because we're animated by that Spirit. The CIA themselves proved that. I'm not coming from a pulpit. I'm coming from the documents of the Central Intelligence Agency, that we're animated by that Spirit. And so anything that's antagonistic to that Spirit will pinch us off a little bit from that connectivity. It stands to reason that that's what would occur inside of us. But we have the capability and the free will to do that. And if we have an environment primed to encourage that more, then you end up, I think, in sort of a vicious cycle. And the same is true in the other direction. If you have an environment that's very high flying, very charged with love and appreciation, very charged with resoluteness, firmness, stoicism, but in an honorable fashion, a moral fashion, being willing to impart mercy and lawful truth and judgment to a situation, that type of environment is going to encourage completely different spiritual behaviors coming from the human being. So you've got this massive monument. I know I've waxed on a tangent, but I'm coming back for the audience again. Just bear with me here. You've got this monument that sits in the center, nearly the center of the Washington, D.C. area. It's a 10 by 10 area, and it is a giant wavelength suppressor. And so what it does is it generates a very high wavelength at the top of the obelisk, but at the base of the obelisk, it generates a very low, I don't think it's ELF, but it's a very low wavelength relative to the top of the obelisk. And then it amplifies that field out for a distance of at least a couple of miles in every direction. 3 or 4 miles, I think, is the estimate in every direction. So you literally have a spiritual field being created inside the physical reality medium that we live in that is going to encourage lower wavelength behavior, lower, what we would call sinful behavior coming from the human being, rather than amplifying the other parts of the human being, which find themselves amplified when you're having a really beautiful moment or experience with God in church, or when you've had a really powerful experience in your prayer closet and you just feel filled up with that love and full of that love. That type of behavior and that type of expression from the human body can be encouraged with the environment that it's in. It's why the cathedrals of old had bells of a certain frequency and tonality placed within them. It was to encourage that part of the human being to come out of the physical form rather than these more suppressive and negatively oriented capabilities. And so that's a very long answer to your question, but we have to keep in mind that everything is spiritual first. And that's how these people have beat us for so long at this game. They kept our eyes on the physical world while they moved all of the levers in the background. They manipulated the game board that they had us staring at the whole time. But now we've taken our eyes off that board and we're actually looking at the person behind the curtain on the other side of the room.
That's fascinating. you mentioned the Washington Monument, and I think in previous discussions we've talked about the unusual parallels between three cities on the planet: Washington, London, the city of London, which is not the entire city that we think of. It's 1 square mile of London, where most of the financial industry is, and the Vatican in Rome. And what do they have in common? Well, they each contain an obelisk. Now, the Washington Monument is the largest of those, but think about St. Peter's Square. What stands in the middle? An Egyptian obelisk. What an odd thing to put in the middle of a Christian square. And same thing in the city of London. There's a obelisk that sits along, I believe it's next to the Thames River, within that city confines, and it's known as Cleopatra's Needle. So isn't that fascinating that we have those parallels? And we're going to add a couple screens to this broadcast so folks can see some of the things you were describing with regard to the shapes around these structures in Washington, because they are there. And if you know what to look for, you'll see them each and every time. We brought up earlier the name Paulina Luna, who's a sitting congressman from Florida. And some of the things that she said, we brought up the Ethiopian Bible. And one of the things that she disclosed on her discussion with Joe Rogan was that when she was sworn in, she chose to be sworn in by placing her hand on an Ethiopian Bible, apparently signifying that she believes that's probably the more proper Bible to use in the grand scheme of things. In addition, there are hearings going on right now with regard to these UAPs, and the perhaps the nature of these will be discussed and disclosed before too much longer. We hope that that proceeds. But isn't it interesting that she herself in her discussion drew some parallels between the notion of religious beliefs and what we may need to assimilate as we learn more about what these UAPs are, their origins, their meaning, their goals, perhaps, and other things. The notion of good and evil, perhaps it exists everywhere, and perhaps we need to understand that as we begin to learn more about some of these technologies. Go ahead. I saw you were going to make a comment, SG.
Well, it's very interesting, I think, on this particular issue, because it harkens back to a question from earlier about, how would we broach the topic of the Bible having been edited throughout history? And I think we have to go back and appreciate that if pride comes before the fall, and if his ways are higher and his thoughts are higher than ours, what greater pride is there than to think that we have the entirety of God's record here in the world based on our individual life experience, right? In other words, what level of pride could be greater than to say, I know it all already, and then there's not any more, and anything more is invalid. As we look at the discovery and really the rediscovery for many of those out there in the population of this idea that we're not alone in the universe, this Roswell's sort of been a cultural understanding for a number of decades here in the United States. There's long been an understanding in the military families across this nation that things aren't as they seem, that there's a lot more out there as far as capability, as far as interactivity, that you can't be having millions of people all around the world over a period of 65 to 75 years having these ETs, quote unquote UFO experiences or UFO encounters. They're not all suffering from mass formation psychosis. Some of them may be, but it belies reason to think that the entirety of humanity across national boundary lines, across cultural understandings, across language barriers and life experiences is going to have the same encounter and then decide that they're going to fabricate it. So when we look at what's happening with Miss Luna and with others like Representative Burchett in the Congress and in the Senate, you have individuals that are clearly pressing forward to blow the cap off what the government knows with respect to our place in the universe and perhaps our place amongst a grander chorus. And we have to keep in mind that as human beings, we often put God in a box, right? We see each other throughout the course of our lives. We all pretty much look the same with a few variations and some mix up in there. And I think in some cases we conceive that God is going to be exactly like us and only like us. And maybe that's not entirely true, right? We have Christ, who is obviously a man who came and lived here in the world with us, but was also God incarnate himself. And I think that's worth balancing into the equation. But to think that he would, cut off the entirety of all of God's creation, all of his Father's creation, in lieu of, basically picking a favorite creation, I think that's a little bit haughty as well, and perhaps a dangerous territory to go into intellectually. So when we look at potentially having a chorus of beings, created sentient beings that God the Father created to glorify himself and the universe amongst us, I think it stands to reason that some of that may interact with one another, that some of that chorus is going to do business with one another, learn about one another, trade with one another, visit with one another. We have records going back thousands of years in different spiritual schools where there seems to suggest there was some sort of commercial relationship with super powered beings or half god, half human beings at different points along the way. We have, again, I go back to that modern media and that entertainment produced by Hollywood, right? The Hollywood tree, the tree of all magic, right? It's the Druidic tree of magic. And those productions that come out of Hollywood show us portals to different realms and where other entities live and how we can go and visit with them. We have, if you go and look at the any of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, any of the Transformers movies, you have all of these, or a great deal of the Marvel movies, all of these themes sort of tie back to this same central concept that we are not alone, and that the interactions that we as humanity can and have had with these types of other sentient beings out there in the universe are just as normal as everyday life, driving down the road to get your coffee in the morning.
Yep. So given all the topics we've talked about today, if folks have not already begun following you, I bet they want to. So let me put this up so folks know where to go. This is these are the various places that SGAnon provides his information. And so highly encourage you to watch, highly encourage you to follow so that you can be up to speed as things continue to progress. I can't help but think that we are approaching, hopefully soon, even more disclosures in various areas that will help begin to explain some of the things that we heretofore probably either overlooked or believed the narrative that was given to us. And now that we're in a position to question, I think we're starting to have more queries that need to be answered, and hopefully we'll be able to wind our way collectively toward those answers. SGAnon, any other final thoughts, sir?
Well, I think my final thoughts are exactly what you just highlighted, Bill. We're in a period of time now where humanity has an opportunity that they've never had before. We have the ability to examine who we are, where we have come from, what this planet means to us, and what we mean to each other in a simultaneous way across all of our international boundary lines. That has never really been possible in a worldwide format before, but this information ecosystem that we're all now a part of allows us to have discussions and really to begin to investigate the questions, the really deep questions about life and about our place in the universe that we've not been able to have and not been able to do at any point before, and to do it in a way that we have a commonality of understanding. In other words, we're sort of peer reviewing the science as we go along, if we'll put it in that fashion, right? Because it's all on display. It's all transparently there. You can find all sorts of things now on video platforms all across the internet. Even just a few years ago, you couldn't find hardly anything about most of the topics that we covered just today. And as people begin to understand more and more about their power as human beings and about their place in the universe, under creation and under God, I think that it becomes it turns the journey from one of arduousness and difficulty into one that is fun despite the difficulty. It's fun. It's sort of like exercising, knowing that you're feeling better, that you're going to be healthier. There is this period of time throughout the process where it's unpleasant, and you can feel that it's unpleasant, but the desire to feel good and the knowledge of how good it will feel when it's over makes it all worth it. I think that's exactly where we're at as a people, and it's just going to get better from here.
That sounds wonderful. All right. We promise to have you back much more quickly than we did this time. And we wish you well in the meantime. Thank you so much for making time for us today, SJ.
Thank you for having me, Bill. Good to be back.